Hi everyone. So in class today, what we're going to do is we are going to discuss biotic potential a little bit more, and we're going to deep dive and actually figure out how to calculate that. We're also going to review the data that we collected last time on the tomato seeds, and our goal is to finish entry 20 today if we can. So I'm going to hop into that presentation. And again, it's about biotic potential. It's the same one that we started with last time. But I'm going to hop down to day 2. So if you're following along in the PowerPoint, it's slide 13. And this is what you were left with last time. We kind of went a little unorthodox, and we started with our B page just to kind of get our analysis down. And then we're going to end up taking some notes on this information on our A page today. So let's just kind of discuss. We're going to look at the graph first, and then I will kind of go through the questions with you as well. So here's the graph that I got, and yours should look, strikingly similar. You had the same exact set of data. I changed my colors to match the color scheme that I randomly chose, but your colors might be totally different. And as long as the bars are of similar number, then you're good to go. So in class, I'm going to have everyone just kind of observe the graph and then kind of type out in the chat window any kind of observation that you can make. You can also see the math element here to the right that I had done in a couple of these Excel cells off to the right, min, max, average, and mode. So you can see those there. So in the chat, I'm having everyone either do an observation about the graph or about the math piece. But some of the things that you might notice is that clearly this pink bar here is the highest. So there was a majority of tomatoes that had seeds somewhere in the 80s. And that makes sense because the mode is 82, or the most frequent number seen is 82. So we kind of see that outlier here. We can also see that it looks like an arch distribution. If I kind of draw over top where that lies, you can kind of see it makes, in this case, we have kind of an outlier here with a large, but you can kind of see that it does make a little bit of a bell curve here. We have much less on the extremes with the low end having 21, and we have much less on the opposite extreme with, in this case, 112 being the maximum number of seeds that a tomato had. And then there's the majority there in the middle. So that's similar to the other distribution that we have seen with skin color and hair color, and other things that we haven't really been able to see distributions for, like heart disease and others. So I ask you now, what does this represent in terms of how many genes then do you think control the tomatoes and the number of seeds that they may have? How many seeds might that translate to? How many genes might that translate to? And the answer is that because of this particular distribution, it suggests that tomato seeds, or the number of tomato seeds that a plant or a tomato might have, would be polygenic. Remember, we kind of learned that it's controlled by multiple genes, and that's when we result in this kind of distribution. So it's probably more than one thing that's controlling the number of seeds that these tomato plants have. All right. And then in terms of some of those analysis questions that you had on the bottom, number 1, if you really dislike seeds, which tomatoes would you want to breed to get closer? Well, it's kind of like a similar situation with dogs, right? If you want a really small dog, then you pick the 2 smallest dogs and you breed them together and hope that you get a small dog. Or if you want a really big dog, right, you'd pick the 2 biggest ones and breed them together. So in this case, if you really dislike seeds, most likely, kind of from the graph here, you are going to be picking tomatoes that come from this low end side, the one that had 21 seeds or maybe one that's in the 30s, and bring them together and try to create, tomato babies that come from that side of things. And then you might be likely to shift the data, perhaps, in future generations. If you were to selectively breed them, that pretty much answers, question number 2. We might expect, if I have this, let me fix that. If we have this chart here of the original, just kind of outlining what we have here, like so, you might expect that this could shift a little bit to the lower side of things, so that over time you end up with more and more of them having less and less seeds. So you might see this shift over time where the average might be closer to 40 instead of the current average that's at 73. And similarly, you could do the opposite. If you got a whole bunch more, tomatoes where you wanted to have more seeds, you could potentially shift it the other way if you focus on breeding just, plants with tons of seeds and tons of seeds and tons of seeds. All right. So hopefully you kind of just made some predictions here. Our essential question, if we remember, is what can we predict? So we have existing tomato information. We have our existing graph. And today we're going to talk a little bit about maybe how we can make predictions based on this information. So we wrote this down last time, but if you didn't get it down on your A page, I want you to make sure that you have your essential question. What predictions can we make when we study a population? So pause if you need. Otherwise, we're going to work through our A page notes today. Okay, so thinking about our tomatoes, let's say I took one of the tomatoes with an average number of seeds. We calculated the average to be 73 seeds. So I have a tomato, I've got 73 seeds, and then I went and planted each seed. Would I then get 73 adult tomato plants in the next generation? What do you think? Why or why not? So in the class, I'm going to have everybody kind of think about this question and then type in the chat their thoughts. If I took 73 individual tomato seeds and I went and I planted them, would I have 73 tomato plants in the next generation? Yes or no, and why do you think that? It does kind of lend into our topic today of biotic potential. So just think about it. There's no right or wrong to that thought. But then kind of piggybacking off of that, let's say that all 73 tomato plants thrive and we have 73 new adult tomato plants. If every one of those tomato plants had 100 tomatoes of their own and we plant all of those seeds, how big is the next generation going to be? So I'm going to have everybody kind of take a guess in the chat. And I want them to also articulate, do you think that would happen? So, thinking about 73 tomato plants, each and every tomato has an average of 73 seeds. You plant all of those seeds, how many tomato plants are we looking at? And does that actually happen? So again, just kind of a thought question that's relating to what we're talking about today. And so this lends itself to the topic of biotic potential, and now is the time where we're going to actually pick up and take a couple of notes. Step 1, we need to really define biotic potential. I keep saying it ties to the topic of, but what is it? Biotic potential is the maximum reproductive potential of a species, given optimal conditions. So, for example, it's the perfect case scenario, no obstacles. A female member of a species has the most offspring that they could possibly have, and all of those offspring live and thrive and grow up, and so on. So it's kind of the maximum amount of offspring that a species could have if everything was optimal. So there are no predators, no disease, plenty of space and resources. It's utopia. Wide open field. Nothing is going to stop it. That is what biotic potential is. So for example, sea slugs have about 14 billion eggs in their lives. In one slug's life, it lays about 14 billion eggs. If given optimum conditions and biotic potential, right, it could bury the earth in 3 generations with that many eggs. Because if you think about that, 14 billion eggs grow up to be sea slugs of their own, and each one of those sea slugs has 14 billion eggs that hatch and thrive, and then each one of those sea slugs has 14 billion eggs. It's kind of crazy. Even cats. Cats, given their litters every year, and those litters having litters of their own and so on, just 2 cats can eventually yield 320,000 cats in 10 years. That's pretty insane. But that's the idea of biotic potential. And we can actually calculate that. And we can also use information about current populations to predict how large and how fast future generations will be. Because, clearly the earth has not been buried in sea slug eggs or sea slugs. So we can kind of use what's been going on through history up till now to make predictions on how much of that biotic potential is realized. So we're going to do a calculation, and this is where I do want you to write this down. How do we find biotic potential? There's 3 key pieces of need to know information. You need to know the number of offspring per litter, the number of litters per year, and their lifespan. So depending on the organisms, sometimes, right, they could have multiple litters of babies a year. Sometimes they have 1 litter of kids a year. Sometimes they have even less than that. Maybe it takes 5 years, to have a litter. It just kind of depends. But given maximum potential, cranking out offspring, for a human female, it's about 10 months from conception to birth. So technically, we would say a female can have a kid about once a year. And then you would think about all of the lifespan or the reproductive years with which an organism can do that. So we kind of calculate it in the steps across the bottom. Number of females, so how many females do we have? How many eggs or how many offspring are they having in a given year? And then how many years are those kids being produced? Knowing that obviously a baby can't have children, and obviously the senior citizen animals cannot have children either. But the lifespan with which they can have children. So we're going to work through this example. Please make sure you've paused and gotten the kind of 3 need to know pieces down, and then we're going to work through it. All right. So I put the info in the bottom, and I've kind of set up what the equation would look like if we started with just 1 female. So assuming there was a male at some point and they did their thing, we have 1 female who's going to have babies. We're going to calculate that female's biotic potential. given the fact that they can have 5 eggs per nest, and they have 2 nests a year. So that means that every female can technically have about 10 eggs a year. And they do this across 3 years. So in that first generation, one female can lay 10 eggs over a 3-year period. That means that that first generation, that one female can produce, if we multiply it out, a total of 30 starlings. So every female mama starling can have a total of 30 baby starlings in its life, at maximum, given no obstacles. But now, let's see, what happens if those 30 starlings, that first generation goes to have offspring. We need to assume, right, that in any given set of offspring, half are male and half are female. So if that first starling ended up having 30 kids, we can kind of assume that 15 of those kids were females. It might not be exactly that, but we're going hypothetical here. So half of that first starling's children are female, so we're going to say 15. And each one of them will be able to have 10 eggs a year for 3 years. So that means in the next generation, that is 450 starlings. That is a lot of babies, right? Again, given optimal conditions, everyone survives, everything is awesome kind of deal. Let's take it a step further. What about the third generation? We have to assume that half of these 450 starlings are female and half are male. So we would then assume that 225 of them are female. If we look at how many eggs they can have, right? 225 females at 10 eggs a year, at 3 years a female. That's 6,750 starlings, starting from 1. So in 3 generations, we have been able to go from 1 female starling to 6,550. I can't speak. 6,750 starlings. That is a lot. And third generation, that would be like year 9. So within 10 years, you've gone from 1 to almost 7,000 starlings. Does this happen in real life? Do we have that many starlings flying around? If not, try to think about why. Let's take another example. Let's look at sea turtles. So green sea turtles live for about 40 years. They produce 1 litter or nest a year with an average of 100 eggs per nest. How many green sea turtles would there be after 30 generations? So again, we're kind of rounding here. Yes, not a sea turtle might not have a litter for every single one of its 40 years of life. But again, optimum conditions, max amount of reproduction. So if we start with 1 sea turtle and it then has babies, we got to remember our formula here. We're going to need the number of females, how many eggs it has every year, and then how many years that's going to be. So if we're looking at the first generation, that is, 1 turtle, and it's going to have 100 eggs per year times a total of 40 years per every 1 turtle. Yikes! So what would that translate to? Well, 100 times 40, 4,000 turtles. Yikes, that is a lot of turtles. So technically one turtle, if it laid 100 eggs a year for 40 years, would make 4,000 turtles in the next generation. That's a lot. If I keep going, we would assume that half of those are female, half are male, so only the females are having kids. So we have 2,000 turtles laying 100 eggs per year for 40 years. If we figure out what that is, let's see. You would take 2,000 times 100 times 40. So now we are up to 8 million turtles. That is a lot of turtles. What if I went further? Next generation, half of them are female, and let's say each one of them lays their maximum number of eggs a year for 40 years. We would end up with a lot of turtles. So many zeros. 16 billion, I believe that is, turtles. Do we have that many sea turtles on planet Earth? Oh, I think I missed a factor somewhere in there. No, we do not have that many turtles. We, in real life, have only about 6.5 million sea turtles left on Earth. So with that said, why? Why do we not have more sea turtles? Why are we not, I'm realizing now that my calculations were one order of magnitude off here. So I need to make sure to fix that. There we go. Why don't we have 16 billion turtles out there, or even 8 million turtles out there? Why is it that we only have 6.5 million sea turtles left? So what I'm going to have you guys do is just think about why and add your thoughts to the chat. Why is it that we don't have that number of turtles on the Earth? And so then at the end of kind of us just talking, kind of putting it all into perspective, is it realistic for an organism to reach its biotic potential? Yeah, probably not, because it's just not possible to sustain that. So at the bottom of the A page, I'm going to have people kind of list some of those factors that they brainstorm that can prevent an organism from reaching its biotic potential. And so I want you to do the same of brainstorming at the bottom of your A page what that could be. I do have a picture of my notes that kind of gives some clues as to what we would discuss in class, but you might come up with your own. And then the last thing we're just going to talk about as a class is, why is it useful to consider this number? Like, why do we even care if organisms aren't going to reach it? Well, it's important to know what that potential is. If more resources become available, then populations can explode, or invasive species that make it to new areas that aren't limiting in any way, their populations can have huge growth spurts. So it's kind of important to know what the max is for projection purposes in different areas. So here's just a picture of my notes. Kind of the 3 factors to look for here are boxed in green, and then I have the starling example and the sea turtle example. And then at the bottom, I have a couple of ideas of what might be limiting potential. If you're up for a challenge, you can try to calculate the number of offspring in the first 3 generations of these organisms. You only have to pick one, and I'm not forcing you to record this at any spot if you're just up for a challenge. And I do have the answer key here too, so you can kind of see that worked out, at least for each one of these, how many that translates to after 3 generations. For example, if one female octopus has 50,000 eggs in her life, what does that translate to in the 3rd generation? And so on. I also have this short little video on biotic potential that I plan to show in class. So if you have the PowerPoint open and available, go ahead and give that a quick watch. So kind of wrapping it up, we have discussed and analyzed the distribution of traits in a population. We learned a little bit about biotic potential, specifically and how we calculated it. And we discussed a little bit about things that can influence biotic potential. So the homework task for the day is to complete entry 20. And then we're going to kind of deep dive on how we can see shifts over time, the meat of evolution, next week. All right, that's it. Thank you.